The Fairey Battle was one of those unfortunate aircraft that found itself becoming obsolete before even entering frontline duty, and then being sent into frontline duty anyway. In the opening stages of World War II, squadrons of battles suffered very heavy losses, and when you look at the design, it's easy to see why. The aircraft being thrown into battle during the Battle of France in 1940 were born from a specification that was first issued by the Air Ministry way back in 1933. This specification, designated P2732, was for a two-seat daytime bomber, its intention being to replace the Hawker Hart and Hind biplane bombers. The aircraft was to be capable of carrying a 1,000-pound bomb load over a distance of 1,000 miles whilst maintaining an airspeed of 200 miles an hour. Now, looking at this with hindsight, those performance numbers seem pretty dismal, even by early 1930s standards. However, the Air Ministry was in a bit of an awkward spot. Firstly, the Great Depression had severely undermined any attempts or even suggestions to modernise large parts of the Air Force, and secondly, there was a legitimate concern that the design and use of heavy bombers could become limited by the Second Geneva Naval Conference in 1932. In that conference, they weren't going to be just talking about ships, but other weapons of war as well. And despite being issued in 1933, the aircraft specification was first drawn up by the Air Ministry in mid-1932 before this conference had taken place. The Fairey Aviation Company quickly set to work making a design to submit to the Air Ministry. It was decided very early on that the aircraft would make use of the brand new Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Eventually, this would make the Fairey Battle the first operational service aircraft to be outfitted with the famous power plant. The compact but powerful engine allowed the Battle to have a very clean design, which itself further boosted its speed performance. The aircraft's fuselage was to be manufactured in two sections. The forward section would use a tubular steel structure to support the weight of the nose-mounted Merlin engine, and the rear consisted of an all-metal monocoque structure. Several aircraft manufacturers submitted designs to the Air Ministry, and the Fairey Aviation Company, along with Armstrong Whitworth, was selected to produce prototypes of their designs. The first prototype of the Battle was designated K4303, and it took off for the first time on a brisk spring day, March 10th, 1936. To its credit, the aircraft completely met the requirements of the Air Ministry's specifications. It could carry a bomb load of 1,000 pounds, and it achieved a top speed of 257 miles an hour in RAF flight evaluation tests. It also was able to meet the range requirements, clocking in at around 960-mile range with the full bomb load. However, by 1936, these performance figures were already considered obsolete thanks to the emerging aircraft from the rapidly expanding German Luftwaffe. Despite this, production of the Fairey Battle went ahead, and an initial order of 155 aircraft was placed under the Air Ministry's new specification, P2335. The RAF was desperately in need of aircraft. Whilst several promising designs were being evaluated, it wasn't going to solve their present problem, and the Fairey Battle would give them something to use in the meantime. The first production battles were received by RAF squadrons in mid-1937. By the outbreak of war, the Battle equipped 8 training squadrons in No. 6 Group and 10 frontline bomber squadrons in No. 1 Group, forming part of what was to be the Advanced Air Strike Force. In early September 1939, 10 Fairey Battle squadrons were moved to France in preparation for a possible bombing campaign against the Ruhr. However, this campaign was only going to be retaliatory, meaning that they would only launch bombing raids on the Ruhr if the Germans bombed them first. This, of course, didn't happen, as Germany was gambling on the Allies taking a purely defensive stance whilst they were busy invading Poland. And so the Western Front settled down into the Phoney War, whilst more Fairey Battles were being sent into service. During this period, the Battle was used to fly reconnaissance missions over the German front lines. It was during one of these missions, on the 20th of September, that Battle Gunner Sergeant Lechard shot down a Bf-109, giving the Fairey Battle the distinction of earning the RAF's first aerial victory of the war. Over the autumn and winter months, the Battle would be sent on many reconnaissance missions. However, the aircraft's obsolescence was already beginning to show. The Battle's defensive armament was poor. In fact, it was considered poor in 1935 and downright woeful by the advent of 1940. The pilot had use of a single forward-firing .303 Browning machine gun that was mounted in the right wing, and the rear gunner had the use of a single pintle-mounted .303 Vickers machine gun. The small caliber of the guns, combined with their small number, and the relative difficulty of hitting the significantly faster German fighters, meant that most engagements were rather one-sided, and the battles began to take significant losses. This was of course rather worrying, as the air combat theatre at the time was relatively quiet and sporadic, and the air staff had grave concerns for the inevitable conflict that would come when the German army shifted their gaze westward. When the Battle of France kicked off in May of 1940, the battles were sent in to perform low-level strikes against the rapidly advancing German army. Not only did this make them vulnerable to high-energy attacks from German fighters, providing top cover for the advancing troops, but the low-altitude strikes made the battles vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns and even small arms fire, as many of the battles lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. This was a flaw that had been highlighted earlier, and whilst some battles had their original tanks hastily swapped out for self-sealing ones, many more simply had 4mm armour plates bolted to the underside and the rear of the fuel tanks. It was a stopgap fix, and one that only half worked, and the combat losses of the aircraft started to become horrendous. On the first day of the German assault, 13 out of 32 battles were lost in action. The next day, 9 battles in service with Belgium were sent to attack bridges that connected the Meuse River and took heavy losses, with only 3 returning. The same day, 7 out of 8 RAF battles were shot down attacking a German column. On May the 12th, a group of battles suffered almost 100% casualties as they attempted to attack critical bridges over the Albert Canal, which connected to the Meuse River. The commander of the formation, Flight Officer Garland, and his observer Sergeant Gray were both awarded posthumous Victoria Crosses for continuing the attack despite overwhelming ground fire and enemy air assault. The worst day by far for the battles was the 14th of May, when 35 out of 63 were lost during an all-out attack by the air striking force against German bridgehead positions at Sedan. Not long after this, the RAF began pulling its aircraft back over the channel to the safety of British soil. By the time the last aircraft of the air striking force had been sent back over to Britain, over 200 battles had been lost over a period of 6 weeks. Immediately after this, the battles continued to find frontline duty, mostly in attacking shipping targets moored in Channel ports as Germany prepared for Operation Sea Lion. But it also found service in other theatres as well. Battles served in the African theatres as well as over the skies of Greece, however they still took very heavy losses there. In fact, most battles in the Greek theatre were destroyed on the ground before they could even do any meaningful damage to enemy positions. By the end of 1941, the battles were far behind what was needed for frontline service. A few were being kept on for remote maritime patrols, but even they would eventually be replaced by newer, faster aircraft that would have superior range. It was then that the battle found itself in a new role that it actually rather excelled in, that of a training aircraft. Its forgiving handling characteristics made it ideal for acquainting new pilots to the world of flight. The Model T variant of the Battle was built as a dual cockpit trainer that had dual controls. Some also featured a gun turret for bomber gunnery training, and some even retained their bomb sights for bombardier training, thus providing the RAF with a remarkably flexible training platform. In this new role, the Battle saw extensive overseas use as part of the Empire Air Training Scheme. 739 were sent to Canada, over 350 to Australia, 150 to South Africa, and a handful were also sent to New Zealand. This amounted to almost half of the total production run for the Fairey Battle itself. When the last production aircraft was delivered in September of 1940, 2,200 battles had been built. They remained as trainer aircraft throughout the war, and many were also converted into target tugs, until finally being phased out of service completely by 1949. Several surviving examples of the battles can still be found, with the best example of the original Mark I variant being displayed at the Royal Air Force Museum in London.